Hello, welcome to the Roundtable. We bring you expert views and in-depth analysis on latest issues happening around the world. First, I will introduce our guest. We are joined by Dr. Kim Hannah. Welcome, Dr. Kim.
Thanks for having me again.
We are also joined by Dr. Lee Kyung-seok. Great to have you again.
Great to be here again.
Recently, former US President Donald Trump again made incendiary remarks, putting the NATO allies on alert. He renewed concerns for South Korea too. Professor Lee, what did exactly say about the NATO?
So recently in a rally in South Carolina, Donald Trump revisited the NATO defense spending issue on the table. Donald Trump exactly said if the NATO countries do not pay more money for maintaining the alliance, that he will encourage Russia to attack NATO members. I would say the coast burden sharing issue between United States and NATO members is not a new issue. For example, he criticized the NATO members that they're paying less for the NATO alliance. So in 2023, only 11 NATO members, they reached the 2% of GDP defense spendings. In 2023, however, United States spent 3.5 GDP of the defense spending. This is like a huge number. So United States accounted for approximately 60% of the total NATO budget. So from the Trump's perspective, the NATO members are reckless member states. They wanted to rely on United States, freelining to United States as security commitments. So in that response about Trump's inflammatory remarks, Joe Biden and Nikki Haley, another Republican presidential candidates, and the General Secretary of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, castigated Donald Trump's irresponsible remarks.
Dr. Kim, for the sake of our viewers in the world, could you give us more detailed explanation about the NATO and its members?
Yeah, so NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was established in 1949, and it was essentially a collective security system where member states would agree to protect one another if there's an external aggressor that appears and attacks one of the member states. And it was originally created to counterbalance the Soviet threat, but even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has continued to remain as a strong alliance. And currently, there are about 31 member states, which include 29 from Europe and 2 from North America. And Finland joined last year, and Sweden is moving closer right now to becoming a NATO member as well.
Right. Against the expectation of the security experts at the end of the Cold War, many years ago, who predicted the end of the NATO in the absence of the military threat from the former Soviet Union. NATO went the opposite direction for expansion, right, with more members. That's very unexpected and surprising phenomenon.
Right, and it continues to counterbalance Russia right now as well.
Right. Dr. Lee, as Professor Kim mentioned, that after Finland joining the NATO, Sweden is next in line to join the NATO. Right. What accounts for this phenomenon that the traditional neutral countries in Europe made a strategic decision to actually join the NATO?
So it is really interesting because Sweden has hold its position as a neutral state, not joining NATO or not joining the security bloc led by United States. But Sweden decided to join NATO, and definitely the main driving force is such a drastic move. It's the external security threat from Russia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually alarmed Sweden politicians and also the public. So especially the public in Sweden, they have a drastic shift to join NATO. They feel the accidental threat from Moscow, and to guarantee the security, they thought they should be join the United States-led NATO collective security systems.
Yes. Dr. Lee, don't you consider this a very paradoxical and surprising, because one of the justification made by the Putin government of Russia for its invasion of Ukraine is Russia has to defend itself against the expansion of the NATO, but its aggression actually led to further expansion of the NATO.
Right. This is actually the traditional theory of balance of power. Right. So if one aggressor tried to protect from the external threat, then the other side's actually balancing the power to actually for the small state, for example, like Sweden, they wanted to join to the broader and more powerful bloc led by the other counterpartners.
Exactly.
And this is an interesting point that is really it's actually castigating or criticizing Putin's argument.
Right. Currently, Sweden is known to be participating in an ongoing NATO military exercise, which is the largest since the Cold War. But Russia is denouncing the Steadfast Defender 2024 drills. Professor Kim, what accounts for this?
I think it's in part, it has to do with the Baltic Sea being at the center of the conflict. So the Baltic Sea was the Soviet Union's outpost for naval expansion, and the Soviet Union's Baltic fleet was stationed there. And so if NATO gets full control over the Baltic Sea, then Russia will find itself more and more isolated over time. And now Sweden is a naval power, and Sweden has been operating submarines in the Baltic since 1904. So in this way, Sweden is also participating.
So if Sweden joins NATO, that has a huge implication to Russia's security. So what the implication is, if Sweden becomes a NATO member, the Baltic Sea will be under control of NATO. And for the Russian perspective, the Baltic Sea is a strategic geopolitical location for Russia, because the Kaliningrad, which is the headquarters of the Russian Baltic fleet, they have to protect this region, project the military power. So there's actually a possibility that a military confrontation will be occur in the Baltic Seas. And one thing from Putin's perspective, to protect Kaliningrad, they need to strengthen the tie with Belarus because of the geographical proximities.
I see.
The recent summit between Putin and Lukashenko in St. Petersburg actually signals how Putin's actually perceive Belarus. And to strengthen the bolsters the security ties, as you all know, Russia already moved the tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus. And this is actually another sign that Putin will strengthen, intensify the security ties with Belarus and to aim to protect Kaliningrad.
Right. Well, when you look at the geography of Russia, although Russia is such a vast territory, all the main cities of Russia are concentrated in the geographic proximity to Sweden and Baltic states, as you mentioned. So projection of Russia's naval power outward will be greatly limited if Sweden is going to join the NATO and becoming the kind of the defensive line for the NATO.
Right, so it seems as though the Baltic Sea is emerging as this European flashpoint, right? And Trump seems to be adding fuel to the fire. And so European countries right now are quite angered by his remarks, and they're also announcing defense build-up plans as well.
I agree with you, Dr. Kim. I mean, it is one thing that the US president emphasize the transactional aspects of the alliance and the security partnership with other countries for the sake of protecting the national interest of the United States and the American taxpayers' money. But security is like oxygen. It cannot be just subject to totally the logic of transaction, because it's so essential for very survival, right? So as a commander-in-chief of the United States military and a leader of the global power, the president of the United States should be more measured and careful with his or her remarks when it comes to the security partnership. And then, Professor Lee, why now? Why did Trump make such a remark at this point? Why pressure NATO? And what kind of response would you expect will be coming from the NATO members?
Okay, I think there's a two line of thinking. The first audience is definitely, for my opinion, it's the domestic audience. So the domestic audience in United States, they're actually angry about the United States expansionist kind of role. They don't want to pay their money for protecting other countries. Donald Trump's are actually using this kind of inflammatory remarks to get more support from the domestic audience. But at the same time, Donald Trump is also targeting to the European countries. So United States was the flagship that takes all the kind of financial burden to maintain the NATO security alliance. And he actually gave a warning sign, a strong signal to the NATO members that if they do not pay more money, then United States will pull back its commitment. And I don't think this is not just a bluff. When you think about the Paris Climate Agreement, Trump withdrew from this Paris Climate Agreement. There's a possibility that Trump can also pull back the United States commitment from the NATO.
Yeah, this is just my personal opinion, but his remark is, as you mentioned, that clearly targeting the domestic audience for the sake of collecting more votes in the tight presidential race against Joe Biden as his opponent. But we have to remember that America is a country formed by immigrants, mostly from the European countries in the past. So there's a very strong civilizational, psychological, cultural connections between American citizens and European populations. So very potent political leaders making inflammatory comment that United States will not care about the future and survival of European countries may not be sitting so well for the American voters in the presidential election.
I want to add something to Dr. Bong's remarks. So the general United States public, they're really cost sensitive, especially about the financial cost.
Yes.
So the message from the leaders, especially for the political elites, shape their really attitudes towards NATO. So, and from my perspective, Donald Trump's know the financial sensitivity among the United States people, and he's really strategically using this.
I get that, but the remark is way too far. It's too extreme that suggesting that the United States will not do anything to protect the NATO member countries, even if Russia is going to invade them after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Don't you think this is way too extreme?
So, but this is actually, I would say, this is a strategic approach, like from Donald Trump, winning the elections. Then he's using this kind of really inflammatory remarks and really emotional remarks to actually to manipulate the United States public sentiment and using this remark to attack Joe Biden.
Joe Biden.
Yes.
Okay. Is it also working for security partnership between the United States and South Korea? Dr. Kim?
I think in a way what Trump is saying related to NATO and what Trump is saying related to South Korea is quite different. So as Professor Lee mentioned, Trump is demanding that NATO members spend more on, increase their defense spending by 2% of their GDP. South Korea is already allocating 2.7%. So it's not the same situation. But in the case of South Korea, Trump believes that his US allies should exert more effort on their own defenses and or shoulder more defense burden sharing. And because of that, if Trump is elected, as we've been discussing, it's very likely that Trump is going to want Korea to pay more for defense burden sharing. So because of this, I think it would be advisable for South Korea to quickly negotiate the special measure agreement or SMA, preferably before the elections and what the results may show.
See. We need to closely follow the shockwaves that are coming from the changing security landscape in Europe and Trump's NATO bashing. That's going to affect the security conditions on the Korean Peninsula in near future. Let's move on to the second part. We have a video outlining our next issue. Please take a look.
South Korea has officially established diplomatic relations with Cuba, which remained the sole country in Latin America that had no diplomatic ties with Seoul. The United Nations representatives for the two countries exchanged official letters in New York on February 14. Cuba is the 193rd country with which South Korea has built diplomatic relations. Among UN member nations, Syria is the only country that has no diplomatic ties with South Korea. South Korea and Cuba could not improve their bilateral relations because of North Korea. As the only communist country in the American and Caribbean regions, Cuba is one of North Korea's close Cold War allies, and the two countries have maintained brotherly ties. Since establishing diplomatic relations in 1960, North Korea and Cuba have actively supported each other's anti-United States and anti-imperialistic policy on the foundation of comradely friendship between North Korean founder Kim Il-sung and late Cuban leader Fidel Castro. When serving as the president of the Council of State, incumbent Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel visited Pyongyang and met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in 2018. North Korea regarded Cuba with special friendship, as Havana had no diplomatic relations with Seoul. South Korea-Cuba relations have been improving rapidly since the launch of the Yoon Suk-yeol administration. The Yoon administration held behind-the-scenes dialogue with Cuba to forge diplomatic relations and secure a foothold in its diplomacy toward Latin America. Seoul and Havana launched discussions when then Foreign Minister Park Jin held a meeting with Cuba's Vice Foreign Minister in Guatemala in last May. Last October, President Yoon Suk-yeol met with ministerial-level officials of 6 Caribbean countries who visited South Korea to attend the high-level forum on the Korea-Caribbean Partnership. The Yoon administration's active, multidimensional efforts bore fruit, and the two countries agreed to establish diplomatic ties. This Cuban decision will likely come as a shock for North Korea.
옥장이 무너지겠죠. 중국과 구소련, 이 대한민국과 수교했을 때 북한이 엄청난 압박을 받았고 그 정치적 상실감을 느꼈었습니다. 마지막으로 남은 형제국, 또 사회주의 진영, 정신적 지주라고 할 수 있습니다. 그것이 무너지는 그런 역사적인 순간이었고 많은 정치적 상실감을 느꼈으리라고 봅니다.
Keen attention is being drawn to what changes the diplomatic ties with Cuba will bring to South Korea's relations with North Korea and Latin America.
As we saw in the video, it must be really shocking for North Korea. Establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba was one of the long-held diplomatic goals for South Korea. It is said that Seoul made considerable efforts for a long time, and the negotiations began making rapid progress last year. First, Kim, how could South Korea actually succeed in this endeavor of making the diplomatic normalization with Cuba at this point?
Right, so as you mentioned, South Korea has put in significant efforts into improving and establishing diplomatic relations. And this has been going on for about 20 years. So South Korea has been both in public and in private, working towards establishing diplomatic relations. And so it's been doing this particularly in non-political sectors such as culture, human resources, and development aid. And we've seen a lot of positive sentiment being exchanged between the two. And especially the popularity of Korean TV and Korean language has become more prominent in Cuba. So for example, there's a Cuban fan club called ArtCore, and this fan club focuses on Korean culture and the Korean wave, and there are about 10,000 members. So it's quite big. And even before the COVID pandemic, about 14,000 people from Korea would visit Cuba annually. And so we can imagine that with the establishment of diplomatic relations, there's going to be more people traveling between the two countries.
Yes, yeah, that's amazing. The success of the diplomatic relations normalized between South Korea and Cuba, as opposed to the end of the friendship, relative sense, between Cuba and North Korea. I think it is accountable for the fact that North Korea is no longer socialist regime in a genuine sense. It's more like a theocracy based upon personal rule of the Kim family. So from the standpoint of Cuba as a representative of socialist ideology, North Korea is no longer true to socialism as the source of the bonding between the two socialist regimes. So Cuba has all the legitimate reasons to turn to South Korea. We represent the future, the brighter future with prosperity, opening, and as you mentioned, the very strong and attractive soft power.
Right, I guess then Cuba's moving away from North Korea and deterring away, but also finding South Korea more attractive.
Yes, it's a push and pull altogether. Great. South Korea and Cuba look forward to the vast benefits their new relations can offer. Their closer ties will likely to have implications on global scale. Personally, what do you expect as a consequences of the diplomatic normalization between the two countries, especially in the field of political cooperation and the security?
So I think first of all, I think the Cuba and North Korea relationship will not be drastically strained. Still, Cuba will play an important role to North Korea in the diplomatic and international landscape. But the implication and the benefit for South Korea is we obtain a new channel, like a back channel that we can approach to Pyongyang. So traditionally, like China, Russia has been conceived as a really closest ally. And their relationship with China, Russia is important because to actually have an approach to Pyongyang. But having Cuba a new partner, as a new diplomatic partner, South Korea definitely has some incentive and benefit to approach and have like a diplomatic channel with Pyongyang. Also, there's like a strong message to the Pyongyang North Korean political elites. This is actually like a significant event that the South Korea can signal to the North Korean politicians that South Korea is the winner of the regime competitions. And I would say, I definitely think that's a strong signal. And from these benefits, but I don't think there's a huge security and military benefit for South Korea. But from the political and diplomatic realm, I think the normalization of the diplomatic ties between South Korea and Cuba will definitely help.
Attention is also being drawn to how this development will affect inter-Korean relations. Professors, what do you think that diplomatic normalization between South Korea and Cuba, how would North Korea be responding to this shock?
So I think it's definitely one way of thinking is North Korea tried to intensify the ties with the traditional allies, for example, Russia and China. At the same time, at recent, like Kim Yo-jong mentioned, the possibility to holding a North Korea-Japan summit. And this is actually a message that North Korea will want to be not really isolated in the East Asian security dynamic. But I think it's less possible having a summit between Kim Jong-un and Kishida. It's also, I'm a little bit skeptical that the Japanese side will take Pyongyang's offer, the unconditional offer to having a summit. But definitely North Korea will try to be strengthen the ties, not only China and Russia, but other like socialist countries. But yeah, it makes sense that the diplomatic room that North Korea can actually influence, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Professor Kim, what do you think?
I think North Korea is probably taken or caught off guard, especially because North Korea and Cuba have had relatively good relations for quite a while. And originally in 1960, Cuba cut ties with South Korea and officially recognized North Korea. And it was to the point where all three Kim leaders described Cuba as their close brother and comrade. And so we can see that the relationship was relatively strong. And they had a very strong relationship. But also, as Professor Lee mentioned, North Korea is worried that South Korea is elevating itself in the international community, whereas North Korea is becoming more and more isolated. So as Professor Lee mentioned, North Korea is trying to have negotiations and have talks with different countries, for example, Japan. But Prime Minister Kishida originally showed some interest in this, but we're not so sure about how things are at the moment. But also, in the case of South Korea, out of 193 UN member countries, Syria is the only country South Korea does not have official diplomatic relations with. So that indicates that North Korea is going to become more worried about this, especially with inter-Korean relationships becoming more hostile right now.
Right. I was a little bit taken aback that Kim Yo-jong's statement came too fast. Immediately after the announcement of the diplomatic normalization signed between Cuba and South Korea, it means that the North Korean regime must have been really in great shock, right? And proposing possible summit meeting between Prime Minister of Japan Kishida and Supreme Authority of North Korea. But the possibility was framed with very tough conditions. That Japan should not raise the issue of the Japanese abductees, or Japan has to get away from the trilateral security cooperation with South Korea and the United States. So, although the proposal was made, but it was made in a very vague and conditional manner by Kim Yo-jong. Cuba is considered a brother country of North Korea, but it has become the 193rd country with which South Korea forged diplomatic relations. We hope that the two countries will reap great benefits through their closer relations and cooperation. This is all for today. We'll be back with more updates on global affairs. Professors, thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you, and see you next week.